Imagine a country in which millions of people live inside cages. These cages are located far from their homes and families, often in the middle of remote cornfields. Some people are caged for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, sometimes their entire lives. It's not just anyone who ends up in a cage in this imaginary country. It's the society's most marginalized people. People who are already oppressed, already vulnerable. Now, you probably know I'm not actually talking about an imaginary country. I'm referring to the United States of America. This country contains less than 5% of the world's population, but almost a quarter of the global prison population. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. 10 million children in this country have experienced parental incarceration. They've been torn from a parent. Beyond that, 70,000 children have themselves been living in cages. And we do cage our most marginalized people. As the prison activist and scholar Angela Davis has said, prison has become our response of first resort to so many of society's problems, from poverty to homelessness to mental illness to drug addiction. And overwhelmingly, it's poor people and people of color who are caged. In particular, Black people are more than 5 times as likely as white people to be incarcerated in this country. So lately, you may have heard some of these facts popping up in the news. Just recently, over the past few years, incarceration has been making the headlines. This is partially due to a state budget crunch and a new conservative enthusiasm for reform. Suddenly, a number of politicians are wondering whether we should really be spending $80 billion a year on prisons. But also, this shift toward recognizing mass incarceration is due to decades of work by prison activists and racial justice activists and Black liberation activists, bringing this issue into the public consciousness. So finally, we have this mainstream awareness that this prison system has some major issues. It's almost trendy to care about prison reform now. There was a recent headline in the Hartford Courant that said, "Prison reform is the new kale." Sort of is. But current prison reformers are working on everything from marijuana decriminalization to sentencing changes to better conditions in prison. It's exciting that so many people understand there needs to be a change, and many of the changes being advocated are really exciting. But still, most of these mainstream reforms assume that for the right people, whoever they are, prison works. This is a fundamental flaw of mainstream prison reform. This idea that if we just change a few things, the correctional system can indeed function as a correctional system. The assumption is that cages can keep us safe. But here's the reality. 2 out of 3 people coming out of prison are rearrested within 3 years. Prison is not correctional, whatever that even means. Prison is a cycle. So how does that cycle function? Well, first of all, the same people are targeted again and again by police. Policing in this country is grounded in white supremacy and in anti-Black racism. So, most of us have at some point in our lives committed an act that could be considered a crime. But it's marginalized people, and in particular, Black people, who are targeted, who are policed, who are arrested for those acts. Policing is the gateway to prison. And so this systematic racial targeting ensures a steady supply of people flowing into prisons. A second way that this prison cycle functions is that many, many of the people who commit the acts that we refer to as crimes are doing so in the service of their own survival. Prison does nothing to address poverty or economic injustice. Actually, people coming out of prison have even fewer resources and even fewer opportunities than they did going in. Plus, they are emerging from prison with a felon label, and that label makes them even less able to get jobs and housing and education. And very often, they return to criminalized acts in order to survive. A third way that this cycle of prison functions is that hurt people hurt people. So, yes, when we think about the people who are incarcerated for violent crimes, often we don't think about the fact that most of them have been victims of violence in the past. And so prison does not help people heal. Actually, prison continues that violence that people have experienced. So on the one hand, I'm talking about the various acts of physical and sexual violence that take place behind bars, many of them actually perpetrated by authorities. But also, we need to keep in mind that caging a human being is in itself a violent act. The trauma of prison stays with people after they leave prison, and it perpetuates that cycle of harm and violence. Another way in which this cycle of prison functions, and this one is particularly important to me as a family member of a formerly incarcerated person, is that prison cuts off connections. It isolates people from the world. When you cut someone off from their family and their loved ones and their community, you are setting them up for failure. You're cutting the ties that provide support and motivation. Even the Bureau of Prisons recognizes this. They say that the #1 predictor of whether or not someone will reoffend is whether they have support from their family. But what they don't acknowledge is that prison itself breaks down those vital links. Now, what are the rippling effects of breaking down those links? Well, let's think about those 10 million children who've experienced parental incarceration. What does that do? Well, those children are more likely to live in poverty. They are more likely to drop out of school. And they are much more likely to go to prison themselves. Prison produces more prison. We can see this in the fact that prison has not eliminated itself. The correctional system hasn't corrected itself out of existence. Instead, it has grown. It's expanded by 500% over the past 40 years. And at this point, even mainstream social scientists are starting to say that prison is criminogenic. It causes crime. So meanwhile, we need to think about the victims of crimes. What does prison do for them, for crimes in which there actually is a victim? Well, first of all, it might provide some sense of vindication and temporary safety, and we have to take that seriously. We do need practices of accountability in our society. But prison does not provide reparations for people who've experienced harm. It does not provide resources for them to heal. It doesn't even provide an apology. And since prison is a place that promotes harm and violence, it certainly does not provide victims with any indication that what happened to them, the harm that happened, will not happen again. So from all of these angles, we can see that the prison system is not just broken. It is built on a fiction. The problem with the current talk around modest sentencing reforms is that, as the prison abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore has said, we have taken a detour into reform for a few while there is no change for the many. We can't just shave the prison population down around the edges. We can't just try to make prison a nicer place to live. For a human being, there is no such thing as a good cage. We need to dig deeper than reform. So let's picture a different imaginary society. This is a society without human cages, without a prison system. So you might ask, what replaces prison? Well, let's think about that for a second. Prison is this one institution that is supposed to address everything from drug possession to serial murder. How can we possibly think that one thing can address thousands of disparate issues in disparate communities? Addressing harm doesn't look like that. So there's never going to be this one solution that waltzes in to replace prison. Figuring out strategies for dealing with harm in our communities is a collective responsibility that all of us share. Right now, all over the country, we are seeing local success stories, communities doing what works for them. We're seeing places that have eliminated juvenile jails, and meanwhile, communities have built up restorative justice practices, bringing together victims and youth who've caused harm to work together towards solutions that both help victims heal and hold the youth accountable. We're seeing neighborhoods that have drastically reduced gun violence because groups of mothers and grandmothers have come together to spend time outside at night building community. Across the country, people are building movements for racial justice and Black liberation, getting at the root causes of why massive numbers of Black and brown people are being policed and incarcerated. A number of communities around the country are pushing for the decriminalization of drugs, challenging that definition of crime in the first place, and pushing for the establishment of optional public health-based, community-based programs for people who are struggling with addiction. Also, we have to remember that so many people who commit what we call crimes do so in order to survive. And so we need to start changing those structures. We need to support housing, education, healthcare, childcare, the arts in all communities. These are things that have actually been shown to promote real long-term safety. But these are just a couple of ideas. I do not have all the answers, and really no one does, because we still live in a society that's mostly trapped in the prison mindset. So, for example, what do we do about this tiny fraction of incarcerated people who have committed very serious violent acts repeatedly and may need to be separated from their potential victims? This is something that we are going to have to figure out together over the long term as we evolve away from prison. Moving beyond prison will require collective creativity, all of us working together toward a safer and freer world. So as you leave here today, imagine that new society, a place where people are not disappeared into cages, a place where harm and violence are actually confronted, a place where we can imagine the end of violence. Prison doesn't work. We need to come together and imagine what does.